Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bill Dodd, and thanks for taking the time to join us today on Market Journal. We've got another great show in store for you, so what do you say we get right to it? And at the top of our headlines this week, Tarspot has officially been confirmed in Nebraska for the very first time. When Iowa State confirmed the disease in every county on the western end of their state last year, extension experts knew it was only a matter of time before producers in the Cornhusker State would have to face this particular pathogen. Now, Tarspot has been confirmed in several Nebraska counties. This probably won't have much impact on crops this year as we're nearing the end of our harvest season. However, Nebraska Extension Plant Pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems notes that producers should take notice and be vigilant of this potential threat.
You know, that's not a big surprise, right? Because we've known that disease was in western Iowa since 2019. It just hasn't been active since that time because of the dry conditions. But now that we've had more showers, there's been more disease development, and it has crept across the Missouri River and made its way into Nebraska and 2 or 3 counties deep. And so if people want to look at the distribution, at least at what it is to that date, they can check out the website, Corn IPM Pipe, Tarspot. It's related to the Southern Rust website, so they're using the same system to see where this disease has been confirmed.
When it comes to future prevention, one of the best things you can do to be proactive at this point in the season is to scout any field still standing for the disease. However, there are a few key things you should pay particularly close attention to while scouting for Tarspot.
I want to make sure too, if they're out in the field, they can also look for Tarspot in their own fields. And so what they're going to be looking for are black dots on the leaves. But this is really hard to find right now in most places because there's such a low incidence of it. And so just know that you can't rub these spots off. You can scrape at them with your fingernail, but they don't rub off like insects, insect frass, but they can look a lot like those black Telia and Telia spores that we see with southern rust. So that's probably the most common thing that people are going to confuse it with. And so be prepared to see more of that this year.
While this disease probably won't have much impact on overall yields this year, it's important to remain vigilant of this potential problem as this particular pathogen does tend to overwinter in the fields. Making an early diagnosis could save you some headaches when planning things out for the next spring planting date.
The bad news is that although we don't expect it to impact our corn and yield this year, it will overwinter here. And so next year or in the years after that, when weather conditions are favorable, usually cool, wet conditions, they're going to probably see this disease again. And we're going to need to watch it more closely to help people determine if they need to take management actions. And that could be hybrid selection, it can be crop rotation, or making one or more fungicide applications as needed. And we're still learning about the timing of those applications relative to when disease develops.
If you'd like more information on Tarspot in Nebraska, you can find more resources at cropwatch.unl.edu. If you need any extra assistance in identifying this or any other potential pathogens in your field, you're highly encouraged to reach out to your local extension office or submit a sample to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We've taken the liberty of posting those resources and more on the Market Journal website. Moving on to the markets now, supply chain disruptions are still playing a big role in agriculture, and a recent strike with John Deere could compound some of these problems for crop producers as well. Joining me this week to discuss those issues and more is Iowa State University Extension Ag Economist Chad Hart. Chad, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you.
Well, let's get into the latest crop progress report. Harvest progress numbers seem to be down in some areas compared to this time last year. What was your take on how things are looking nationally for corn and soybeans thus far?
Well, as you're looking at this crop, I mean, the idea is USDA is telling us on the corn and soybean side, we're looking at record crops. That tends to slow things down a bit. When we compared to last year was a little bit smaller crop. Both years we were dealing with droughts, but the idea is last year it gave us the opportunity to get in the fields really early. And so this year is a more, let's call it normal pace. It's still quicker than normal, but still When you're dealing with the potential of a 15 billion bushel corn crop and a 4.48 billion bushel soybean crop, those yields slow things down. And when we look at the flip side of this, like the winter wheat market, we're seeing those plantings take some time as well because of the slower harvest happening as well there. That's sort of, if you will, everything is slowing down. It's not just supply chains that are doing it.
And Chad, on my last check, corn futures were trending down as soybeans were on the upswing after taking a big hit from last week's WASDE report. Can I get your thoughts on how these prices have fluctuated since the release of that report?
Sure. And when you think about the corn and soybean markets with the WASDE report, both crops came in, larger than earlier estimates, and I think a little bit bigger than the trade was sort of hoping for, and so that did put some downward pressure on both of those markets. Now, since then, we've been watching, and I'd say this is the period of time when we start to see traders start to concentrate more on the usage side of the equation. So we're watching for those export reports, especially the daily reports that come in with the larger sales. And every time we get a reinforcing shot of news, like in this case last Friday we got China was nibbling into the soybean market again, that put a little positive pulse in that market. And I think that's the big key as we're looking at both these markets right now, is they're looking for that positive news story to help offset the large harvest numbers that we're talking about coming in.
And wheat was a bit of a shining star in the latest WASDE report. Where do we stand with planting progress so far, and how has the market been reacting?
Well, in the planting progress, I'd like to say we're a little bit behind normal. If you compare to our 5-year average, we're 1% behind. We got about 70% of the crop planted right now. Again, it's slower than last year as well. Last year we had, I believe, 76% planted by this time. But the reason it was a shining star coming out of the WASDE report was it was the one crop where we got smaller production numbers than we were anticipating. Where corn and soybeans had those larger numbers, wheat especially came down a little bit, not only domestically, but most importantly, internationally. We did see Canada take a step back in terms of production, and when you look at the global wheat situation, it is tightening up. That's created a firm base for the wheat market to play off of as we go through the fall here.
And Chad, I'd like to take just a moment to examine the strike currently taking place with John Deere. Has this had any direct impact on crop producers during the harvest season? Are we seeing complications in the field from the strike coupled with an already strained supply chain? How problematic could all of this be for producers if this isn't resolved over the next few weeks?
I think as we look here, the longer it goes on, the more likely we see impacts to farmers. Right now, it's likely any impacts we're seeing right now would be because of supply chain issues before the strike started. But as the strike goes on, you're going to see twofold problems sort of pop up here. One, it will definitely slow down any new orders that have been placed. Those are going to take a lot longer to come out of the plants due to the strike. But I think the bigger market right now to worry about, especially as we say look over the next month or so, would be the parts markets. And when we're looking there, it's one of these deals of not only were parts hard to find before the strike occurred, but now that the strike is ongoing, it's likely going to gum up those supply chains even more. Luckily, when you look at it from the perspective of we're roughly halfway through harvest now, so hopefully most of these supply chain problems, whether created by the strike or not, will occur on the back end where we've got most, if not all, of harvest taken care of.
And with all the supply chain madness, we're seeing some skyrocketing input costs. Now, when you examine the current situation, how could this alter the playing field as far as acres planted in 2022? Just how big of a role will input prices and even input availability be on this discussion?
It will play a role here because, we're seeing these input cost rises at a time when farmers are starting to sit down and pencil out what they want to do in 22. So they're seeing not only, higher land costs as we look out there, but higher machinery cost, higher seed cost, higher fertilizer cost. And we know that that does have an impact on their production choices as we're looking forward. Probably if you want a historical parallel to fall back on, it's probably looking all the way back to 2012, 13, 14. That's a period of time where we were seeing, very strong input cost rises as well. And we did see a definite shift in acreage moving towards soybeans away from corn in order to offset some of those higher production costs.
And Chad, before we run out of time today, do you have any marketing or risk management advice that you'd like to impart on our viewers?
Well, I think the biggest thing as we're looking right now is farmers are really sitting actually in a fairly good spot. Even with all the things we've discussed here today, the idea is we're still looking at $5 corn on the board for quite some time, all the way out into 2023. We're seeing beans hold in this $11.50 to the $12 range as we look out there again, all the way out to 2023. So we're seeing, despite the record crops coming in and despite some of the production problems that we're having, we're still seeing some of the best prices we've experienced in nearly a decade. And so that puts farmers in a pretty good spot to try to lock in some price protection if they want to, or especially in this case, I think a lot of farmers are looking at storing that crop for a while to look for higher prices as we go forward this spring. Luckily, what I've been hearing is crop quality is good enough that we can definitely look to those opportunities and hope that the carry builds as we go through the fall and winter here. And that is typically the case as the export markets tend to heat up at this time.
And there you have it. Chad, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Great advice there from Chad. Next week, we'll be joined by Daryl Peel from Oklahoma State University to get the latest on the cattle markets. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask, please email or get in touch on social media, and I'll be sure to pass your question along. Next up, over the last couple of weeks, we've been joined by UNL Beef Systems Specialist Mary Jernowski to discuss some strategies for meeting your cattle's forage needs this fall and winter. Whether it's how to properly utilize high-nitrate forage or taking advantage of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's crop residue exchange program, the one common thread in all these stories has been dealing with this year's drought. With drought bearing down on several of Nebraska's surrounding states, there has been an increase in cattle producers who are looking to send their cattle to other locations where winter feed resources might be a bit more available. In this last installment of our 3-part cattle care series, Mary gives us some things to think about before finalizing any winter cattle care agreements. With unyielding drought conditions in several areas of the United States, there has been a noticeable uptick in cattle producers seeking to ship their cattle to places like Nebraska, where they might be able to secure winter feed resources for their herd. While the old handshake agreement is still used in practice today and symbolic of trust, you'll want to have a written agreement just to refer to as different scenarios begin to unfold. This raises the question of what to ask yourself and other parties involved about what constitutes a fair agreement for cattle care through the winter months.
Having it in writing has nothing to do with trust. It actually has a lot to do with your ability to make sure that you have communicated everything that you wanted to, that everybody's on the same page, and most importantly is so that you remember what you agreed to. Especially if somebody has multiple agreements with multiple parties, it can become very easy to forget who you agreed to do what with, right? The other thing is that you may decide that, previously you had said one thing, you changed your mind, this year you discussed something else, and now you can't remember what it was. So it's really about, it's a memory for both parties. And I don't think you have to really be thinking about it. It's not because I don't trust you. And I think you can have that discussion. I think most people understand that if I have it in writing, it's going to be more clear. I can refer back to it. And then if there are still some things that aren't clear, it's really easy to say, oh, well, it wasn't in here, so we need to discuss this. Rather than thinking, well, I think I know what the other party agreed to. Now you're like, we didn't actually talk about that. Maybe we should.
When there's one party with livestock who will be entrusting another party with the care of those animals, it's safe to assume both parties will have a lot invested in these types of agreements. This being the case, you'll want both parties to be on the same page before any agreement is reached, and there are a number of questions you should raise before a bargain is struck.
So you want to make sure that everybody is clear on what's going to happen. The very first thing that you probably want to talk about is when would the cattle be cared for, right? So the date that the cattle would arrive at the care location and the date that they would be expected to leave. A couple things about that, especially the date they're expected to leave. Depending on the system, like in Nebraska, a lot of winter cow care agreements have to do with corn residue. And how much corn residue is available depends a lot on the weather, right? So some years we may have some ice storm events that happen and the corn residue is no longer available. If they agreed to take in cattle, let's say, and care for them on corn residue and corn residue is no longer available, you may want to be able to have a caveat that the price changes or that the cattle have to go home after corn residue is no longer available. So you may put some flexibility in there, or it may be a hard date and you have a plan for weather events and what you're going to do. But it needs to be discussed because that's something that's very important because everybody has to be lined up for how they're going to handle those cattle. They have to go somewhere, right? So if they're going to be at the care providing location, that person's going to have to be planned for it. If they're going to go back home, that person has to plan for it.
If you're taking in cattle to graze on your land, one bit of information you'll want up front is the body condition score of the cattle you intend to care for over the harsh winter months.
But when cattle are coming in, particularly if you're thinking about cows, body condition score is really important in terms of their ability, for instance, to weather cold. And also there's an expectation, right, that if I have the cattle coming in, what do you want them to look like on the other side, right? And so you should have a discussion about that as well. Do I need them to maintain? Do I need them to gain weight? Is it okay if they lose a little condition? Probably want to have a body condition score done when the cattle come in so everybody is comfortable with, yes, okay, I think I agree to that. And then the same thing at the end. And again, having a third party do that makes a lot of sense. So everybody's clear on what the situation is and what the ramifications would be if it wasn't what was agreed upon.
Caring for cattle is usually anything but predictable. There are a number of things that could take an unexpected turn for the worst. With that in mind, it's a good idea to hash out which party will take on the responsibility and expense for things such as animal health care.
What's the process there in terms of who's responsible for those costs? Is there some threshold that is going to be used by the care provider and that's included in the cost, and above that, it's going to be paid for by the owner? One of the things that may be really useful is for you to have an agreement upon the fact that if you have a sick animal, there's going to be a communication between the two parties, and they're going to decide together what's going to be done. And in particular, are we going to get a vet involved and bring them in and have them take care of the process, and then who's going to pay for that, of course. But usually it's really good just to have that communication, especially if you have, the one-offs are one thing, like you have some freak event and an animal, steps on something and has a lame hoof or something. But the process, like for instance, if you do have a bout of sickness go through the cattle, what's the procedure that you're going to flow through to be able to maintain the health and the care of those animals appropriately?
Thanks again to Mary for joining us these past few weeks. For this particular story, there was more information than we were able to fit into a small time frame. However, if you'd like more information on considerations for winter cattle care agreements, Nebraska Extension has produced an informative webinar that's available online and will answer most of your inquiries on the subject. We've included a link to that webinar and other helpful UNL beef resources on the Market Journal website. Next up, Tim Jessen ranches in northern Knox County in a rough pasture country along the Missouri River. Carrying on a management strategy that began with Tim's father, Gene, in the 1980s, Jessen has used prescribed fire and rotational grazing to keep invasive eastern red cedar trees under control and to bolster forage production, particularly in the valleys of his pasture land. Jessen hosted the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition's summer tour this year and explained his management system in detail. You can learn all about Jessen's operation in the October issue of Nebraska Farmer. And it's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, things have held out pretty well for producers harvesting around the state up to this point. What can we expect as we hit the tail end of October?
Well, Bill, overall this last week did not produce a significant amount of precipitation, and most of it was confined to the northern one-third of the state as we had that weak upper air trough moving across basically Wyoming and then straight eastward toward the western Great Lakes. And in the meantime, we dropped some light to moderate precipitation. When I say moderate, there was some third of an inch to 4/10 of an inch that were reported periodically throughout parts of northern Nebraska, and some accumulating snowfall in the northwest panhandle basically in that 1 to 3 inch range. So that's 3 consecutive snow events. We basically are looking at a couple more systems that are going to be moving across the country, but it looks like much of western Nebraska will miss out on these precipitation events as they focus more on the eastern part of the state. So as we go to the upper air models, I draw the first attention to that cold air that was responsible with the frost that came into our region with that trough is now sitting over the Great Lakes and kind of pushing westward. At the same time, we have a trough coming in the western United States with basically a zonal flow coming in. So we're going to see what they call an atmospheric river event where moisture piles up on the mountains, and you can kind of see it here on Saturday afternoon that we're seeing that heavy precipitation, and that energy will start to translate its way into the Central Plains, and the first piece will kick out across Nebraska as we go into tonight and tomorrow. We'll have low pressure sitting up over the Texas Panhandle, and then in a secondary low that's over north central Missouri. That's going to bring that moisture up to us, but it may not be sufficient in time to give a wide spot part of Nebraska, eastern Nebraska precipitation. By Monday, we return back to above normal temperatures as that high pressure ridge builds back in, and we get another trough coming in the Pacific Northwest and the western United States. Significant moisture all the way through central California, and we get a break here as that heavier precipitation inundates the eastern Corn Belt, and then we start digging out a trough across the intermountain regions with low pressure by the GFS model expected to develop over northwestern Kansas, and that may bring a little bit better moisture feed up into eastern Nebraska. Most of the moisture at this point will be wrapped around into the Intermountain region, and as that system moves into the center part of the country, GFS wants to split the energy. Low pressure over the Texas Panhandle will lift copious moisture up over the southern Central Plains, and we will see some precipitation breaking out across the eastern half of the state and then pushing eastward, leaving most of western Nebraska high and dry. And then on Thursday, as that ridge builds up in the western United States, we get a northwest flow, so another cold stretch of air coming into our region behind that front. So those that did not get freezing temperatures or hard freeze across eastern Nebraska, most likely will see this we get into next Thursday, into next Friday. As this front blows through, we're going to pull a lot of cold air. As that intensifies over the eastern Corn Belt, we start to see high pressure developing over our region, and that looks like it's going to hold maybe through the end of the month before we start to see this next system of the Pacific Northwest start to move toward the east-southeast into our region. So we look even farther into the future, 8 to 14 day forecast. It takes us from next Thursday to the following Tuesday. It includes the Halloween weekend, above normal temperatures as that ridge is in place, and in terms of precipitation, well below normal moisture. So we have a couple systems that'll hit eastern Nebraska, and otherwise than that, it's fairly dry conditions over the western part of the state.
Thanks, Al. For our last story of the day, we're going to take a look at a group we got to know at this year's Husker Harvest Days who go by the name Farm Rescue. Now, we all know that helping one another through difficult times is the right thing to do, and those actions can strengthen our communities. Since its founding in 2005, Farm Rescue has assisted just under 1,000 farm families in need of help, with more than 90% of those operations able to maintain their family operations. With so much past success, the organization is currently trying to grow its footprint. On the farm, a crisis can arise at any time, from natural disasters to personal injury. In these moments of personal crisis, oftentimes agricultural producers can depend on friends and neighbors to help them protect their bottom line. Unfortunately, that might not always be the case. And that's where Farm Rescue comes into play.
Basically what we do is what people would consider their neighbors would do for them if they're in a crisis situation. So if a family member or a ranch worker experiences either an illness or an accident or natural disaster that takes them out of the farming and ranching operation, Farm Rescue steps in to be that person. So we come in and we can do the planting, hay baling, harvesting, or livestock feeding for an organization. We can also source feed and hay for those livestock operations. For a farm or ranch family to be eligible in the Farm Rescue program, all they have to do is go online and fill out a very simple application. And in most cases, within 48 hours, our board will review it and get it approved so we can send volunteers to their operation to help them.
While there are some limitations to what this organization can offer as far as acres planted or harvested, if there happens to be any delays due to weather or mechanical failure, Farm Rescue will be there until the work they set out to do is complete.
We have a limit as far as the number of acres that can be harvested or planted. Usually, that's between 500 and 1,000 acres, and our volunteers will come in. And again, farming and ranching is based on weather. So if The opportunity is great weather-wise. They could be able to get that done with our state-of-the-art equipment in just a matter of days. If they get delayed due to weather or breakdown or something like that, then they'll be there longer. And we can rotate volunteers in and out. We have 300 active volunteers right now, but we have over 1,000 in the database on who we can call on. All we ask in return is that the farmers may pay for the fuel or the input costs, like the seed and chemical that goes into the ground, but we do everything else.
With plans of widening their regional footprint, Farm Rescue will undoubtedly continue to seek more volunteers. When it comes to who volunteers, whether you have farm experience or not, if you want to get your hands dirty, Farm Rescue can find a fit for you.
We need volunteers that know how to run farm equipment, and we also need volunteers that may not know how to run equipment, but they can drive a pickup to go get parts, or they can be there to lend support and just whatever else may be needed by the farm or ranch family. Anyone wanting to volunteer, don't hesitate, because you never know when you may know someone in this situation or you may need the service yourself. But being able to give back to the ag community the way all of us do, it really takes a servant's heart, and we can find a job for anybody that has a passion for agriculture.
A really great outfit providing opportunities for those in need to recover and get back their livelihood. If you know of a family in need of assistance, you're encouraged to call 701-252-2017 or email info@farmrescue.org. If you'd like more information on what Farm Rescue does or how you can contribute to their mission, you can visit farmrescue.org. And that's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, we'll be joined by Oklahoma State Professor of Agricultural Economics, Darrell Peel, to get his thoughts on the markets. Plus, see what new technologies are being employed by producers around the country and how getting involved in UNL's on-farm research could help employ these new innovations. We'll hope to see you right back here next time. Till then, I'm Bill Dodd. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.